I think this was always a mirage that there was going to be any quick peace. It was rhetoric for populist consumption that peace would occur. Putin would grant a peace before Trump was inaugurated on day one or even quickly. It is not in Russia's interest.
During the presidential election, Trump was claiming that he could put an end to the war between Ukraine and Russia immediately. And now we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the peace will take time. So, what are your thoughts on the latest
Yeah.
developments?
I think there's a funny term that we started using with regards to Trump. It's you have a concept of a plan. You don't have a plan, you have a concept of a plan. So I think this was always a mirage that there was going to be any quick peace. It was rhetoric for populist consumption that peace would occur. Putin would grant a peace before Trump was inaugurated on day one or even quickly. It is not in Russia's interest to negotiate a peace. Russia is interested in subordinating all of Ukraine, and until they are proven that they can't do that, meaning that there is a much more robust support for Ukraine to stifle those aspirations, there is really little to do to convince Russia to take on some sort of peace settlement. Ukraine, on the other hand, of course, is in certain regards desperate for peace, but not at the cost of sovereignty, not at the cost of its territorial integrity and coherence. There are maybe formats in which you could achieve a temporary Russian control over some territories, but not in perpetuity. There would have to be some exclusion and the realization that eventually Ukraine would have the opportunity to regain all its internationally recognized territory. So there is no real prospect for peace. And the way that Trump is going about it is the worst possible direction to take with regards to Putin, granting all sorts of concessions very, very early so that the Russians bank those concessions. And then the Russians advance their objectives at no cost. So it delays the idea of achieving peace. And I think Marco Rubio understands this. And the question is when, and it's going to take some time, when Putin will convince Trump that there is no possibility of peace, because that's what it's going to take. Putin is going to have to demonstrate that he is not a good actor. He is not really. He's not going to deliver on peace, and then the U.S. might have a change in its approach, but it's going to be some time before we get there.
So we understand that negotiations require some incentive for both sides to
Mhm.
come to the table, but we see Rubio recently saying that we don't need antagonistic language toward Russia, despite them being the antagonistic actor in the war.
Mhm.
Trump saying that Ukraine is more difficult to deal with in the negotiation process, as if it's not the future of their country that is at stake. So why? And we see that the United States is apparently pushing the EU to ease its sanctions against Russia. So why do you think the Trump administration is so eager to appease Russia?
It's some theater of the absurd because Marco Rubio understands that that actually tough language and tough actions required. But he also understands that Donald Trump has a very, very serious desire to be friendly with Putin. This is a long-standing pattern. This approach has to run its course in certain regards.
Mhm.
That it'll have to be Russia that is consistently a bad actor, is unyielding. That's going to have to again prove itself to not be able to deliver. Yes, of course, Russia sounds very, very friendly and accommodating because they understand that the easiest way to get something out of Trump is to flatter him. The Ukrainians are also quite, I think, accommodating in certain regards too. I mean, they'll use those niceties and be grateful and thankful, but where they won't compromise is again is on sovereignty and territorial integrity and the need for guarantees because of the most clear understanding of Russia. Trump is deluded. Ukraine has a clear understanding of Russia and the fact that they've repeatedly broken agreements. So and then now there's this pressure on the EU. That is probably not going to yield that much results because of over the course of the past 70 days, just a really brief time and tenure for the Trump administration. The U.S. has proven itself to be a bad actor, friendly to enemies and adversarial to friends, squeezing our friends' economies, breaking with the common threat perceptions, values to support democracy, and common interests. So I don't think that this pressure is going to work. I think what you'll have is, frankly, more manipulation of Trump. Things that sound seemingly good but yield no results. You'll have that with Russia. I think the Ukrainians are in fact going to probably adopt some of that nice sounding language. Yes, yes, sure, we're happy to do something, but no follow through. And the Europeans the same way, because this is really the unfortunate feature of how you interact with Trump. It's not necessarily substantive. It's really rhetorical, what sounds good, political announcements, and that's the transactional nature of Trump. What I hope that the Ukrainian leadership ultimately recognizes is that there is little to do to win Trump's favor and get Trump to change his tack towards Russia, and that unfortunately Ukraine is going to have to hold its line, and there's a very good chance that the U.S. is going to suspend support even for a longer duration. The urgency is for the Europeans to step up in a bigger way and fill some of those holes, even though they can't do that holistically. The U.S. absence is just too leaves too large of a vacuum.
Amid all of this, we have seen some worrying comments from US officials, most notably Steve Witkoff telling Tucker Carlson that the Russian occupied regions of Ukraine are Russian speaking and therefore somehow wanting to be part of Russia, ignoring the fact that these annexations were done at gunpoint. Why? We can say even that this misunderstanding of Ukraine happened even before the Trump administration, though. Former President George H.W. Bush was warned by Soviet officials about so-called nationalists in Ukraine who wanted independence. Former President Barack Obama wanted to have a restart with Russia. And then we had the annexation of Crimea and the start of the invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. So why do you think the U.S. continuously looks at Ukraine through the Russian perspective?
So this is the theme of my latest book, The Folly of Realism, how the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. It's actually deceives itself about Russia and betrays Ukraine. It should be present tense, not past tense. But this is a consistent pattern, and it's all six administrations for 35 years under Yeltsin, under Putin, under multiple different Ukrainian presidential administrations. The U.S. has catered to a desire to achieve more with Russia than is possible. The Russians have their own world views, their own interests. They want to be the regional hegemon. They want to have an exclusive, a privileged sphere of influence. They've been trying to keep control of their former empire, now independent states for decades, through influence, through coercion, and escalating to hybrid warfare, trying to steal elections, and then ultimately military aggression. And that is at odds with the U.S. Values and interests from a historical standpoint, even though that might not be the case at the moment under Trump. This is a long-standing pattern of the U.S. leadership succumbing to hopes and fears, hopes that you could do more with Russia, and fears that if you hold Russia accountable, you condemn their actions, you're conditional in your engagements, that the relationship will devolve into something worse. And because we did this repeatedly over the course of years, and Putin has been in power for 25 years, he's been emboldened to graduate mischief making to military aggression, and we in fact in a way contributed to this escalation and to the situation by breeding impunity. We also missed an enormous number of opportunities along the way to help support Ukraine, especially when, after the Orange Revolution, Ukraine made a hard pivot to Western orientation, a break with its Russian Eastern leaning national view. And we could have invested in Ukraine, from a financial standpoint, from a partnering standpoint, to help Ukraine transform, and frankly, from a military standpoint, to harden Ukraine against Russian aggression. If we didn't do that in 2004, there's less excuse to not do that in 2008 after the Russia-Georgia war. And there's really no excuse for us to have been so restrained after 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. So we've made this mistake over and over. And what we're seeing with regards to Trump is repeating those mistakes, but they're so exaggerated that it almost looks different. But it's a part of the same pattern. It's just exaggerated and amplified in a way that looks far, far worse, but it's part of a consistent pattern of believing Russian propaganda, buying into Russian exceptionalism. Witkoff specifically, takes this narrative wholesale, as almost like a child, being told something and then parroting it back, because for two reasons, I think. One is that he really doesn't care about Ukraine, to tell you the truth. There should be no mistake. The Trump administration could care less about Ukraine. They would be happy to mortgage off Ukraine for nothing, if they think that that's a way to normalize relationships with Russia. So that's malice. That's maximum malice. But it's also maximum ignorance, because they don't understand that this is not an effective way to bring about the end of the war. That this entirely transactional approach that the U.S. has been sustaining with regards to Russia has been counterproductive and really precipitated a far, far worse bilateral relationship condition than if we had held to our principles, supported Ukraine at multiple points along the past 35 years.
In your book, you advocate for an alternative ideology to realism called neo-idealism. For our viewers who haven't yet had the chance to read your book, could you briefly go into what that is? And also, how realistic do you think we can see a country like the United States adopting a neo-idealist approach to geopolitics in our lifetime?
In our lifetime, very realistic. So I'll start there. Um, we will all live long and prosperous lives. So it makes it easier to make that kind of prediction. So the book is in fact a fundamental rejection of realism, which breeds a hyper transactional approach. If countries pursue their national interests and pursue those national interests maximally, everything is about what is immediately in front of you, a deal. And then you have somebody like Trump, which is the ultimate embodiment of the a folly of realism. And based on this multiple points along the past, whether it's Ukraine's independence and the U.S. Efforts to suppress that independence with that infamous Chicken Kyiv speech, the denuclearization under Clinton, the Orange Revolution, our failure to seize that opportunity or to attempt to punish or constrain Russian growing aggression, the Georgian War, the war starting in 2014. It's a consistent pattern of showing how realism was a failure. So we know that if that's the base case, then we need to start looking for alternatives. We don't want to keep failing. And my proposal is really a return to some roots in the U.S. and within democracies. It's the centrality of values to interests, understanding that values are indivisible from interests. Now, does that mean we always sacrifice interests to values? No, that's highly impractical. We have too many countries that are realists or transactional, and that have things that the U.S. needs, like oil in Saudi Arabia. We have to be sometimes practical in the way we deal with adversaries, like negotiating arms control, strategic arms control agreements, is a net positive for the whole globe. And we were successfully able to delink that approach from the broader downward spiral in the U.S.-Russia relationship. But what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't constantly and consistently sacrifice our values to our interests, because then we become very, very transactional and we repeat the mistakes of the past. So my solution is quite practical. We rebalance from this hyper transactional approach to something that puts values first. It needs to be a correction because of where we're headed in the U.S. We are making all sorts of mistakes. We're breaking all sorts of relationships, and we need to rebalance. That means we put values first, and then on that basis, we start to think about what really matters to the U.S. It's actually our fellow democracies that are critically important to us. They're the source of security and they're the source of stability. Europe as a whole has been the most important and vital security arrangement we've had. The Europeans and the other fellow democracies will be there for us when we are under pressure, like they were in 9/11. Not empty promises that Putin gave to George Bush about fighting the global war on terror, but legitimately the support that we received from our fellow democracies fighting in some foolhardy wars in the Middle East for 20 years. They were there. So it's security and it's prosperity and it's focusing on democracies. It's hardening our fellow democracies that are under pressure, attacked by aggressive regimes with regards to election interference. It's bolstering struggling democracies. That would be including some of your neighbors, Hungary and Slovakia, that are under pressure and facing an illiberal slide away from democracy. And it's nurturing democratic institutions around the world as they are under increasing attack from the authoritarian world. So that's the idea. Theory sounds too distant and theoretical. That's the idea. That's the approach. It's a very practical rebalancing. And I think we have practitioners. I think Ukraine is often thought of as a exemplar of neo-idealism, basically defending the democratic world against authoritarianism with its own blood and some Western treasure. I think we have other examples in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe. There are pockets of neo-idealism, I think, in the United States. And for me, the reason I could say this confidently that we're going to get there is because we're going to break so many things with regards to our institutions over the next 4 years that there's going to have to be a correction. Too many people are going to be left out. Too many people are going to be the losers of this Trump approach that enriches the wealthy at the cost of the working folks. And that correction is going to allow us to focus on a values-based approach. I tend to be a pessimist at this moment, just because I know how difficult things are going to get. I perceive that challenges in Ukraine over the next 6 months, I think the U.S. is going to wind down support. The Europeans may be too slow to escalate support, but Ukraine is not where it was 3 years ago. It is now has an industrial base. It could weather some of these challenges. Russia is under enormous pressure. So I think of it more as a kind of a pragmatic view that we will have to, this is where we'll end up just from the perspective of survival.
If you found this video insightful, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories from Ukraine. And if you want to support independent journalism, consider becoming a Kyiv Independent member at kyivindependent.com/membership. Your support makes our work possible.